Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about violent crime in Chicago making the national spotlight and the continued inflow of non-citizen migrants to Illinois. I'll then join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Between the Consumer Price Index, inflation, and job reports, it feels like you need a PhD in economics to fully understand the economic news happening around us every day. That's why you need the Everyday Economics Podcast. Join host Chris Krug and economist Dr. Orfe Devungi as they help you understand the economic world happening around you every day. Listen to the Everyday Economics Podcast at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcast.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here are some of the top stories from the past week. Violent crime was the focus of a traveling U.S. House Judiciary Committee in Chicago Tuesday. Testifying was Gianno Caldwell, the Fox News contributor and someone whose teenager brother was shot and killed in Chicago. He said with the end of cash bail and do not chase policies, criminals feel emboldened, turning the Windy City into Gotham City. He said Chicago is savable, but residents have to make adjustments.
If the folks in Chicago don't start voting differently and demanding justice versus becoming numb to what we see as a daily slaughter, then we can't get anything done. We can't have movement.
Democrats did not attend the hearing, some telling the media their focus needs to be on crafting a plan to keep the federal government open by the end of the week when funding runs out. Caldwell said their absence Tuesday is disappointing.
Many of the folks who've said Black Lives Matter, and they do, but they're not showing that Black Lives Matter by not being here today.
Chicago police crime statistics show overall crime up 77% over the past 2 years, with vehicle theft up 211%. Governor J.B. Pritzker is asking communities outside of Chicago to help house and provide services for the continued flow of non-citizen arrivals, totaling around 15,000. Chicago neighborhood groups shared frustrations with growing number of migrants being housed in their neighborhoods and the drain on resources. At an unrelated news conference Thursday, Pritzker asked other communities from throughout the state to volunteer.
I hope that cities will raise their hands and offer assistance. We have provided grant opportunities for cities that will do that.
But he's hedging expectations.
So when you think about, let's just move them into the wide open spaces of rural Illinois, that's not going to happen because these folks do need help. And those kids need to go to schools, and some of those schools are not big enough to be able to handle the number of kids.
The city and state are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on the crisis on things ranging from housing, food, healthcare, and education. Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square executive editor Dan McCaleb. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I am Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me today is Greg Bishop, the Center Square's Illinois Capitol Bureau's senior reporter and editor. How are you today, Greg?
Well, we are just rocking and rolling. Got an incredible amount of things to tackle here in Illinois, Dan.
Yeah, and why don't we start with a national focus on the state of Illinois this week, Greg? More specifically, Chicago. Chicago was the focus of a congressional hearing this week in the city of Chicago on gun and other violence that has plagued the city. We live webcast the congressional hearing at thecentersquare.com, and you covered it. Tell us about the hearing, Greg.
So this was the U.S. House Judiciary Committee, kind of on a traveling hearing circuit of sorts. They've held a similar hearing in New York, and it's not necessarily uncommon, though it is rare that these committees take to the road. Well, it was a hearing in Chicago at a Fraternal Order of Police Lodge where they had 3 witnesses. One being a Fox News commentator who is the brother of somebody who was shot and killed in Chicago. Chicago. And he says he's made it his life mission to highlight and raise issues with violent crime in Chicago and elsewhere. You also had two retired Chicago police officers, one a detective, one a officer out on the streets, who was actually shot 5 times, and their partner was murdered. So they shared their experience of experiencing violent crime in Chicago, and they had various members of the committee there asking questions, and a lot of the focus, Dan, was on the end of cash bail, and Illinois being the first state to end cash bail statewide. But the committee also heard about lax policies in general from local prosecutors, and even policies within the Chicago Police Department under previous mayors and the current mayor, raising issue with more violent crime. The statistics were brought up multiple times, and if you look at Chicago police statistics, it shows a variety of different types of crimes are up by double digits in some cases. I think over the past 2 years, motor vehicle theft is up 211%, as are robberies up around 40 some odd percent in the past 2 years. So they're definitely tackling a lot of tough issues, but it seemed to really circle around the idea of policies being put forward by prosecutors and by the Democrat-controlled state house. Interesting to note, Democrats were not available at that committee. They did not attend, even in Democrat-controlled Chicago. They did not attend this hearing brought by the U.S. House Judiciary Committee and Republicans. And they said that the work that they need to be doing is back in Washington, D.C. to get a budget together for the possibility of a government shutdown by the end of the week. So while the focus was on violent crime, there seemed to be a lot of politics at play as well.
Yeah, and the Democrats who did not show up, the committee members, congressional Democrats, said they weren't doing it because it was just a Republican political stunt. But you just quoted the crime stats there, Greg. Violent crime before the cashless bail law went into effect earlier this month. I mean, it's been an ongoing issue with Chicago, and the residents who live there, many of them anyway, I'm sure can attest to the problem. State's attorney, Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx has taken criticism for her approach to prosecuting criminals. Did her name come up at all during this hearing?
She was definitely mentioned several times, and even one of the retired police officers saying that they hope the next state's attorney shores up the criminal prosecution element of that office, because Kim Foxx is not running again. She had announced she's not going to be seeking re-election, so that opens that field up. So I think whoever is going to be looking to take that office, they're gonna have a tall order to tackle when you have retired law enforcement and others from Chicago. Even those neighborhood groups on the streets, they don't feel safe. There have been, countless instances of people even being robbed in broad daylight, and stories after story of what seems to be, groups of people with firearms doing, vehicle hijacking and robbing people on the streets. So it's obviously a growing concern in Chicago, and I think one thing that the U.S. House Committee was trying to highlight, even though they acknowledge there's not much they can do to have federal law in a way require the local prosecutors or the state of Illinois to have certain policies. But some Republicans did say by highlighting what's going on in Chicago and elsewhere, it could show what types of policies that local officials should not implement if they want to make sure that public safety is top of mind.
Got it. That was going to be my next question. Is there anything that's going to come out of this? Was this mostly a fact-finding mission by the committee? Certainly, Congress can't dictate police and judicial system matters to the city of Chicago.
Yeah, and one of the questions asked was, is Chicago savable? And that was a question from Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz, and one of the witnesses said, while it seems like the city of Chicago, the Windy City, is actually turning into Gotham City, he believes that it is savable, but he urged for people to change their who they elect to elect better leaders and to focus on true criminal justice policies that don't allow for the streets to become rampant with violent crime.
Well, thank you for reporting on that very important topic, particularly to Chicago residents, Greg. But let's move on. Speaking of Chicago, another story out of Chicago, as we've reported over the past year plus at thecentersquare.com, and you and I have talked about this on Illinois in Focus too, is the dozens and dozens of buses that are being shipped to Chicago of foreign nationals who have entered the country, who have crossed the border, whether legally or illegally, in Texas and other southern border states. That continues to be an ongoing issue. Housing of those migrants who have been transported to Chicago is a concern. We wrote again at this week at thecentersquare.com about that ongoing problem. And as more and more buses arrive, I think we've said that more than a dozen buses have arrived in the past week alone. What is Chicago and the state doing about it?
Yeah, a lot of tax dollars involved here as well, let alone all of the humanitarian concerns. We've seen the videos, and just walking down the streets in Chicago, people can see it. The number of migrants that are in police stations, sleeping in lobbies, or at a YMCA, or at a hotel, and all of the various problems that arise thereafter. We've seen about 15,000 migrants arrive to Chicago over the past year. 15,000. Now, while New York's dealing with 60,000 or so, either way, you've got a tremendous amount of resources that are needed. We've got as well how much that's going to be for migrant base camp tents. And this is an idea that the city of Chicago is moving forward with, a $30 million contract to have migrant base camps heading into the winter months. So even Governor J.B. Pritzker on Thursday, he said that he's raised concerns about that, but he understands that that's not the only option for the city of Chicago. So while the city is, spending tens of millions with an estimated hundreds of millions of dollars of a budget gap, a lot going to the migrant situation, the state's giving money as well. Tens of millions of dollars for housing, let alone the more than $500 million in the budget for non-citizen health care over the age of 65, fully taxpayer subsidized. But you've got, again, those humanitarian concerns. But with the ongoing crisis in Chicago, you've got the governor now asking for other jurisdictions throughout the state, in the suburbs or elsewhere, to assist. And the governor said today that on Thursday, as we're recording this, and the story's at thecentersquare.com, they're giving grants to local cities that will volunteer to assist in this. How much that type of program is going to cost, we'll have to get to the bottom of. But the governor is seeing the issues in Chicago, and he says he's working with federal and city officials to get tax resources where they're needed. But with the growing number of buses, 22 just in the past week, going to Chicago, it's obviously the drain on resources impacting those neighborhoods, and even neighbors saying that they don't have any room, and they're pushing for taxpayer dollars to go to the neighborhood for improvements or for programs, but instead they're seeing a lot of resources being used for the new arrivals, the non-citizens. This is compounding quickly, and even Governor Pritzker today indicating that he's asking for other jurisdictions and municipalities to step up and help. And he acknowledged, he says, you can't just put these new arrival migrants in some rural field in Illinois. That's not going to happen. You need the facilities. So he's asking for those cities to step up and that have those resources and those facilities to possibly take on some of the burden of dealing with this crisis. And how this crisis ends, not sure, because Chicago is a sanctuary city. Illinois is a sanctuary state. And what that means is the city and state do not assist federal immigration officials for deportation orders if that's the only reason to go after a non-citizen. So that's where the sanctuary policies come into play. But the governor says that Republican states need to step up and help out as well, aside from just the sanctuary cities and states taking on that burden.
Yeah, and one other thing that Governor Pritzker has done previously, and that's been highly critical of Texas's Republican governor, Greg Abbott, who is behind at least part of the busing of these migrants to Chicago, to New York City, to Washington, D.C., and other sanctuary cities. But of course, Texas has the longest U.S. border with a foreign country, in this case being Mexico, and that's where the vast majority of these migrants are passing through into Texas. And they've seen millions of migrants cross the border, many of them illegally, since President Joe Biden has taken office. And Governor Abbott himself has said this crisis is not going to end in Texas, in Chicago, or elsewhere until President Biden steps up and closes the border. So I don't, and President Biden facing re-election next year, looks to be the Democratic nominee for president again, but he's got another 16 months in office at least. So I don't see this changing anytime in the near future, Greg. But let's move on. We've talked a lot on Illinois in Focus and written a lot about at thecentersquare.com about the embattled Illinois Department of Children and Family Services, all of the issues they've been facing. Well, we reported this week at thecentersquare.com on a new Auditor General report highlighting many of those issues. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so it's been an ongoing issue with the state's agencies. They get audited every year or every other year, and several different types of audits, compliance audits or financial audits. And this week we've seen compliance audits out for the Illinois Department of Corrections and the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. So let's start with the adverse opinion that was given for the state's child welfare agency, DCFS. DCFS has been plagued with all kinds of problems, from how they manage caseloads to even the safety of DCFS employees who have to go out into the field and handle situations in families where there might be allegations of abuse. But some of the findings that the Auditor General highlighted to make it an adverse opinion, which is not something that auditors just throw around like candy. That's a very limited opinion to highlight a pervasive problem that consistently happens with a certain state agency. The Child Welfare Agency, DCFS, being the one of this particular report where they did not, in a timely fashion, report to even schools as to allegations of abuse. They're supposed to be doing these things within a certain time frame, and the auditor, testing a variety of cases, found that they were not following those proper procedures and actually delaying reporting to schools about alleged abuse, and even reporting to law enforcement certain instances of child neglect and abuse. They're supposed to be reporting these things within 24 hours. There were some instances where they tested the cases and found that it was 48 days or so before they actually reported some things. So these stack on top of each other with DCFS, with all of the other reports that there are from the Auditor General and elsewhere. But you've also got the story of AJ Friend, a 5-year-old who was murdered by his parents, and you've got 2 former DCFS employees who did not follow policies on trial. That trial resumes next month, and that's just I guess in a way, a tragic story that allegedly is the result of not following the types of policies that really are highlighted in the Auditor General's report released this week of DCFS. So DCFS was one issue, and obviously there's going to be a lot more attention on that in the days and weeks ahead. You've got the Illinois Department of Corrections. They also had an audit. It was not an adverse audit, but still findings there, dozens of findings, and even I think 40 repeat findings that are found year after year after year after year, according to the Auditor General. There as well, the one really big thing that stuck out, aside from, employees at the state's prisons not, having proper training in a timely fashion, another really glaring thing that was part of the IDOC audit, the Illinois Department of Corrections audit, was that they were not reporting to local law enforcement when they were releasing individuals who were serving time for a variety of different types of sex crime related crimes. From child, sexual exploitation to a variety of other things, people who should be on the sex offender registry. So while they may have reported to local law enforcement, it was not in a timely fashion. And that was another pretty glaring thing from the Illinois Department of Corrections report. And these audits are important, and even Governor Pritzker over the summer recognized the importance of the audits. But he said that sometimes findings are repeat because state statute isn't clear and technology's updated, so they don't have to follow the same procedures. So he kind of blamed previous audit findings on things like that. But he says the new findings are things that we should be taking a look at. It can give some indication of how certain policies might have to change. But it's not just these two. We've had other audits. If you recall, the Illinois Department of Employment Security and all the taxpayer fraud from unemployment that went out. You've got numerous audits of that agency that are stacking on top of audits of a whole bunch of other state agencies. But it really does give taxpayers a bit of a view inside how government can be functional or how government could be dysfunctional.
Interesting, sad, but thank you for your insight into that story, Greg. We have time to talk about one more story. Again, we've written a lot about at thecentersquare.com about Illinois' declining population, despite what some want to say that Illinois is growing and not losing population. All of the evidence points to people fleeing the state for other states, net out migration. We've also reported and talked about here about Illinois' worst in the nation pension system, underfunded liability of at least $140 billion. Some actually put it at much higher than that. And now we wrote a story this week sort of connecting the dots between those two different storylines. Declining population, of course, means fewer taxpayers in the state, Greg, and that means fewer taxpayers to pay into the pension systems. Tell us about this.
Right now, Illinois is spending 1 out of every 5 tax dollars it takes in from taxpayers. They're spending 1 out of every 5 of those on pensions. So of the $50+ billion budget, more than $10 billion is going to pensions. So that just kind of puts into perspective as to how much of each annual budget goes into pay for the funds that ultimately go to fund those who are no longer working. And after a decade or so of continued population decline in Illinois, where you've got year after year, I think 9 of the past 10 years, there's been population decline, including Illinois losing a seat in Congress because of reapportionment and a declining population. So with that, you've got this worry that fewer taxpayers means less money going into state coffers to pay for things like pensions, while the pension cost continues to increase. And one thing that State Representative Marty McLaughlin highlighted is in order to reverse that, you need to reverse the outbound migration. You need to create jobs. You need to attract employers. You need to have a business environment that does that so you can then attract more workers, more people living in Illinois, and thereby creating more tax revenue to pay off the pension debt. But pensions obviously are a big issue. I don't know if we're necessarily going to hear a lot about pensions during fall veto session, which starts October 24th, Dan. Hopefully you've got that on your calendar. Of course, us at the Center Square in Springfield and elsewhere are definitely ready to be on the ground to cover all that happens during that 6-day session. I don't think pensions are going to be a focus there, but I guaranteed after the beginning of the year, for the second year of this 2-year General Assembly, the state's public sector pensions with a debt of $140 billion and an estimated per capita cost of $37,000 per each man, woman, and child in Illinois, guaranteed that that pensions are going to be part of the conversation after the new year.
Well, again, Greg, thank you for your insights into these important stories, but we are now out of time. Our listeners can keep up with these ongoing issues at thecentersquare.com. For Greg Bishop, I am Dan McCaleb. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe.